Welcome to Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, the podcast show. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and today I have yet another extraordinary guest, Mr. D. John Jackson. He has written a book called What About Me, which is all about kind of the experience of not only people that have been marginalized or the Black community, but really about how do we kind of push forward and create a legacy and do kind of this idea of this more positive life. And I watched his documentary, I've read his book, and I'm just so thrilled that he is here. So welcome, John. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Carrie. Pleasure to be here.
Yes. So I want to start off with that title, What About Me? And you kind of talked about in the book, this is something that is a universal question that young Black boys and men tend to ask themselves quite often. From your perspective, what does that question mean?
I think the way I framed it and posed it, it's a rhetorical question, really for all African American men and boys, Black men and boys, even really anyone. But the focus of the book starts out with Black men and boys. What about me? Because they're in this area of marginalization where there's so many images, so many stereotypes, so many things that are negative. Either, the only positive thing that people think comes out of it, maybe you're an athlete, or maybe you've made it to some form of stardom. But when in actuality, there's so many more components to this group. They're not monolithic, but there's some common themes. And when you look at those common things, unfortunately, there are common threads that tie to their treatment. But by not being monolithic, they're doctors, they're good fathers, they're husbands, they're engineers, bankers, lawyers, you name it. And those are the elements when you think about it. Grandfathers, fathers, good sons, good husbands, but those things don't get to the mass media. And so typically those stereotypes are the things that are the most pervasive. And I think that's where you get this rhetorical question. What about me? I'm a good guy. I'm a good kid. I try to learn calculus, or I try to do good. I have a job. I work hard. I'm a carpenter. I'm an electrician, and those things just get lost.
Yeah, and that's part of why you kind of started the production company and did this documentary, because as you said, the media is kind of portraying it as you fall into one of three categories, generally an athlete, an entertainer, or a criminal. And like you said, there's so much more to who a person is than any of those three. Why do you think that the media has kind of pushed the community into those three sectors?
I think you have to look at some historical angles and historical perspectives. As you watch the documentary, as you read my book, I'm a huge student of history. And I think when you look at those particular categories, that's a natural progression. Those are safe. Those are things that you can easily box in. Nothing wrong with being a fantastic athlete. That's great. But when you look at many athletes, they've got other careers, their jobs. They may be a dentist. They may go on to be a doctor. They have thoughts and ideas. But a lot of times, if you just box a person in, you can minimize a person. If it's an entertainer, you try to minimize the person. He's just a star, or she's just a star. When in actuality, they may be a great poet. They may be great father, great grandfather. And so all of those elements are dismissed. And then the criminalization of it, metaphorically, that just cuts across everything, historically, these supposed criminals. And that's just not the case. So when you look at individuals in these categories, I think media just converges on those three because it's nice, it's easy, it's pat. And in some cases, it's safe because that's the stereotypical mindset of the individuals watching these folks. And that portrayal just regurgitates and replays itself over and over, even around the world. Those images go around the world. And, we hoped to start to put a dent in that and to show that there are many, many facets of men and boys that are just beyond belief. Some of the wildest imaginations, great creativity.
Yeah, it was interesting because in the documentary, a lot of these men kind of talk about the frustration of that. And you talk about in your book kind of walking this tightrope, as you call it. of feeling one way and knowing who they are as a person, and then this kind of judgment that people put on them just because of the color of their skin or maybe what they're wearing when they haven't even gotten a chance to know them. I first would love for you to talk about just how you grew up, because you talk a lot in the book about your parents, and actually the story of your dad brought tears to my eyes, about how they raised you and how they talked about treating people well, and how you treat the people who take out your trash or who clean up the same way that you treat people that are a higher level. So can you talk a little bit about just your experience as a kid from the way you were parented and just your view on life from them first?
Yeah, it's really the core of who I am. What you see here today is really a function of those two individuals. When you look at my mother and my father's deceased. My mom is still here, kicking strong. She's getting up in age and having a few health issues, but she is still wise and giving sage advice, even, at this point. But as I grew up, I was taught at a very early age. And when I say early age, 4, 5, 6, what have you, from my parents, my maternal grandmother, that everyone deserves respect and dignity. We were taught, my brother and my sisters, but specifically me, how I would ask a lot of questions. They made it very clear: you respect people regardless of their race, their color, their creed, their socioeconomic status, what they look like, where they came from, how they talked. Honestly, I think those things that they poured into me are playing themselves out over and over, everywhere I go. And, when you come to the realization that your parents have given you such strong foundation, you start to realize that you've got to share that with the world. I think the other thing that they stressed was, and this is probably the hard part when I talk about in the book, regardless of how someone treats you, you've really got to still be the have the upper hand, or at least have the high road, because they feel that everyone is watching you. And if there's a negative reaction to how people treat you, then that fosters another negative reaction. And so my mom would always say, listen, be assertive, be humble, don't be a fool. Don't let people misuse you. But what they would explain is that you should do everything you can to get a positive outcome and to show others what is it like to respect people? What is it like to give them the dignity? And this went into not just the banker, not just the person who supposedly had a very high and mighty title. It was about the person who emptied the trash, the person who was the gardener, the person who was the garbage man or sanitation worker, the person who's taken tickets. They stress that all of these people are individuals. They have families. They need love. They could be a grandmother or mother. So I took that to heart. And that's the core of who I am, trying to make sure that it is incumbent upon me to let as many people as I know is that is the core foundation. Respecting individuals and respecting people, not because they have money, but because they're human beings. And if we start there, I think the world will be a better place. I think a lot of the issues now is a lack of respect. People don't respect people because of the way they look, where they come from, their accent, their race, their religion. They just, or either they're taught that way and these things are perpetuated. I think we have to get back to that common foundation, respecting individuals, and they deserve dignity. And you go from there.
I 100% agree. As I was telling you before we got on this call, as I was reading your book, I'm nodding my head yes, about treating people well and respect, and was taught in the same way by my parents, that's really kind of the golden rule in all that you do. And I just wanted to, read for a second, because like I said, you talk about this tightrope a little bit. And I just wanted to go through something you said, because I think it's something that people don't realize is happening. So you talk about the Black male stereotypes continue to play a major role in society today. Black males must constantly balance between being able to provide their true thoughts and comments versus a toned down or politically correct response. If you're a Black man or boy and competent, well-spoken, and represent yourself well, you may be perceived as arrogant. Others may not be able to accept the confidence you possess. In your mind, you will have to balance being the best you can be to demonstrate you are fully capable and competent while realizing your competence could be working against you. And you kind of go on with this. Can you talk a little bit about more in depth? Can you talk about where you come from? But this kind of stereotype and balance of, like you said, everyone's watching. You talk about in the book, I think you were for a promotion or something, and someone else was like, hey, we're rooting for you. Like, you're kind of leading us. And there's this pressure from your own community, let alone the whole world. Can you talk just a little bit about how you've dealt with that, or how you notice a lot of people deal with that on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I'll go back to my mother once again, and she told me at a very early age. She said, John, and I talk about this in the book. She says, there will be people who just dislike you when they see you coming. How you look, how you talk, what clothes you're wearing, maybe because you know a little bit more, or maybe your intelligence. There'll just be those kind of things that just happen. So early on, I was prepped and prepared, but there's nothing like going through it. But as you matriculate through college and the workforce and different careers, it starts to become very, very tangible. So much so that you can cut it like a knife. And this is where, when I talk about the traumas and the microaggressions that you endure, these things are really, really stressful and exhausting. So to talk about my experience, it's the case of you're taught to be the best you can be, work as hard as you can because you need to work hard. We had a very strong work ethic. You don't want to have anybody give you anything. You want to go get it. Be creative. Be one of those folks that's a go-getter. But when you get in certain circumstances, stereotypes come into play, and you find out that certain things that you say or do are looked at a little bit differently, or your experiences are a little bit differently. I'll give you one real world example. Early in my career, I was a young engineering manager, and I'd taken over a new team. It was really an excellent team. I think I was probably pretty young, probably the youngest one there. But I will tell you, the behavior of the individuals when I got the job was a little bit very, very cold. There's always one or two people that are a little bit engaging. But the thing that sticks out to me, and this has happened years ago, I had one of my engineers, and I was standing there talking to him, just walked up, and my direct boss walked up as well. And this young engineer said, do I have to listen to what this guy says? And my boss said, yes, you do. What's your problem? And he was like, this guy? I mean, this was face to face. This was not something that I dreamed, but this actually happened. And, I had to reckon with that. I looked at it and I said, it wasn't a joke. It wasn't somebody kidding around. A week or so, and had just walked up. We converged, and this guy was questioning me on, what's your strategy, or what do we expect to do, or where did you come from before? What's your experience? So he was quizzing me, and then he asked my boss, do I have to listen to what this guy says? So that type of very in your face type of thing was something that I dealt with. I listened to my boss's explanation, which was, yeah, sure you do. You do. But that was all it was. It wasn't any outrage or what have you. And I told him I'll take care of it. But when you think about the trauma of that, and then saying, gosh, I got to be even better because this guy thinks he doesn't have to even listen to me. Those are the things you start to look at. And you look at, regardless of your organization, where you go, where you work, there are certain norms in certain cultures about how you dress and the things. A gentleman walked up to me some years ago, and he says, I was wondering if there was anything behind that suit. You could have been just an empty suit. And that came out of a discussion, just had a discussion in a conference room, a meeting or what have you. And he just said that. And I said, yeah, you'd be surprised what you can find in a suit. I just made a comment, but what happens is that those things are piercing. And a lot of people on your callers might say, oh, that was just a joke. People make those kind of jokes all the time. When you look at a person's eyes, you look at their demeanor, you look at their facial expressions, you know they're dead serious.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I obviously can't speak to your experience. I can speak to my experience as a woman. And there was actually interesting because in your documentary, there was somebody that said he was kind of referring to, when people, I don't remember exactly how he said it. He talked about how women say, oh, I think he talked about catcalling. And he was like, oh, it happens. It's not a big deal. Like, what are you talking about? And then he saw what was happening and realized the effect it had on her and what was happening. He's like, oh, I kind of get it now. And there's kind of this similarity of things happening to what you're saying. And I remember, I had an experience a couple times in the past where I'm a very direct person, and I've had a man say, oh, I know how you are. You're very difficult to work with. Or I've told that you're a lot, and I was like, I don't even know what that means. I was like, because I'm direct. Like, I was
Right.
like, it was just kind of a weird, and I knew it was like, it was just not the right thing to say. And I knew that I hadn't done anything wrong. It was just the way that I was speaking. I was being honest and sticking up for myself. And you're right. It's like those things are a lot. And for someone like yourself, if you're hearing that so often, it's just, it's hard, I would imagine. And you talk about in the book, you have a time when I think you were, I don't know, maybe you were like 15 or 16, one of your first jobs. And you were talking about how you worked at this restaurant and you're asked with another person to come in, clean, I guess, the ovens or whatever, and we'll give you free breakfast. And you're, 15, 16-year-old boy, you're like, great, free breakfast. Cool. I'll help. I'll go. You realize that you were kind of being used, that you and this other young man are now doing stuff, cleaning stuff with kind of toxic chemicals. And then they give you one egg that the two of you share. And there's this moment you have as a young teen, which I think is actually pretty mature, for you to say, oh, no, like this is wrong. I'm not going to deal with this. And you end up quitting and you find a different job. And I think that's pretty impressive at a young age to understand that. Can you talk a little bit about, just more of this, how you've noticed this at a young age and as you've gotten older, the importance of understanding your worth as a human being and as an individual?
I think it's so important because your value, never let anyone take away your value, your self-worth. And I understand there's always going to be issues and circumstances where you do have self-doubt and you wonder about, am I valued? What's my worth? Do I matter? And I tell people, absolutely you do. Absolutely. And don't ever let anyone take away from that. Before I answer your question about the one egg, because that's something that stuck with me for a long time. But, my good friends, my co-executive producers, Taru Brooks and Daryl Pitts, Taru and I, we were crafting or co-creating this idea, and Daryl and we all came together. We wanted to get some of these insights that are never heard or misunderstood or really not even known and take those narratives. So that's why when you hear the man talking about when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, it's completely different. And that was a hope for the documentary. And the other hope for the documentary was for it to be a tool, that people can use and show and have groups and talk about, did you know this? Do you understand this history? Do you see the trends, the current, those kind of things? With regard to my understanding at an early age, I knew something was fundamentally wrong for the young man and I to have come in under false pretenses, not getting paid. Hey, can you guys come in, do us a favor? We'll give you breakfast. Hey, we're good teammates. We'll be part of the team. We'll come in. When you literally go in and they give you this spray and this cleaner with no safety apparatus. And when you work for about 3 hours, and we did a great job. You come back and the guy very disingenuously gives us one egg and scrambles it and say, there's breakfast. I knew that there was something, again, fundamentally wrong. And my radar has always been up, not only when I'm being mistreated, I have a very, very high level of acute sensitivity for others being mistreated. And it's one of those things that is just very important. I tell people that you can't stand by when somebody is being mistreated, whether it's at work, at school, at home. You've got to say something. And that comes back to me, again, my parents' training, just being aware that there are things that will go on that sometimes you suck it up. You just have to, you live through it because everybody has a tough day. Some of your listeners may say, hey, no big deal. Everybody has a tough day. But if you find yourself being used,
Yep.
that's where you have to say, this is not right. Don't stand for it. You can do better.
I 100% agree. And that is challenging sometimes because sometimes you do need the money or you don't know how long you should stay. But yes, couldn't agree more on that. I just want to show Jackson, John, your video has frozen just for a second,
Okay.
but I can still hear you. So we can
Okay.
continue, but I just wanted to let you know, I'm not sure if it's on your side or my side, but,
Okay.
so going forward a little bit. So one of the talks that you talk about in the documentary, actually, I think a little bit more, I guess a little differently in the documentary, is you talk about this kind of the police piece, right? We hear this all the time, kind of, the Black community and police. We've seen so much happen recently. And in the documentary, you have a lot of people, they all share their experience. There's not one person on there who hasn't had an experience with the cops where they didn't do anything wrong. They're just driving. They're just being normal. And then in your book, you talk about how your own parents actually sit you down when you get your license. You're so excited, like, I got my license, I'm ready to drive, I want to go with my friends. And they're like, first giving you the talk of, okay, make sure you wear your seatbelt, behave, all of this. You're like, yeah, I want to go.
Right.
And then they sit down, they say, no, we need to have a real talk about this because, you are going to get pulled over by the police for no reason. These are things that are going to happen. And you say, I believe to your parents, you say, but I'm a kid. And your dad says, but you're looked at as a man now. And I would love for you to speak to that either from your personal experience or even just, some of the men that kind of spoke in the documentary about what is happening here. Because again, one guy says, look, this is not every police officer that this is happening. Not everyone is terrible, but there's enough that there's a problem here. Can you just speak to this again, either from your personal experience or just from some of the men that were on that episode?
Yeah, I think there's a broader context and then there's a personal context. The sad part about it, Carrie, is this. When I talked about, Black men not being monolithic, but some of the common threads and common themes, those are things in their interactions with the police, whether they're in New Jersey, Tennessee, California, what have you, those common threads. But when it comes to, my particular experience I talk about in the book, and it goes back to walking this tightrope, that was really the piece when my father started to say, you're entering into the world. And my mother's right there too. My father laid out the very hard square edges and my mother came along and smoothed them off with the finishing touches. But you are looked at as a man. You may be 16, but you're looked at as a man and you have to do things differently. And that's why they go into this, after your proverbial, okay, tell us where you're going, put your seatbelt on, don't drive fast. Now here's a more serious talk. Here are the things that you have to do if you're stopped by the police, because the history of it, Carrie, is that if you go back years and years, this has gone on so much so that families across America, that's why the talk, people think about the talk as something else. This talk for African-American men and people of color is you need to understand what to do if you're faced with these situations. Now, unfortunately, as with the advent of cameras and these things, a lot of these things are being brought to light and you're seeing these experiences. But if you go back 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and even farther, people have talked to their young men and say, here's what you need to do to stay safe. And so to me, that was somewhat a rite of passage to explain you're entering into a world where you've got to be able to balance, even if you're in the right. My mom and dad always say, you just get home to us safely. If there's something awry, you get home safely, do what you have to do, get home safely. Don't you protest. But as you have seen, there are things that just push and get escalated. So that's where, on the broad sense, a lot of men and boys have experienced this. In a personal sense, for me, the reason I write the book from the tightrope perspective, everything that I've done, my leadership, my education, where I've gone, what I've seen, I've had to look through that lens or those lenses. And when I look through the lenses of those issues, I've always had to think 3 or 4 nanoseconds. to say, oh, is that the right place to go? Is that the right thing to do? Oh, the police lights are on. And for me, I've mentioned, just about a year and a half ago, I was pulled over very near my neighborhood, right near my neighborhood. And the sensation that your body gets, you tense up. I'm a grown man and I tense up. I still remember those teachings at 16. I'm driving and I see the policeman and he sees me, and all of a sudden I see the silhouette come back behind me. And as the silhouette comes back behind me, my hands, I grip the steering wheel, I'm like, okay, make sure everything's done, get to a spot that's visible and this kind of thing. And when I get there, I use my best voice. My mother would always say, be very polite, be mannerable. Uh, I would kid my brother. I said, I'd use my best Bryant Gumbel voice to make sure that I'm trying to do everything, not a joking matter, but I'm trying to be as disarming as possible. And what ends up happening, the officer comes forward. He says, hello, sir. He was very nice. He's very mannerable. I said, yes, may I help you? And his story was, we've had reports that there have been cars have been broken into in this neighborhood. And I said, oh, wow. Well, I live in this neighborhood. Gave him my address. This is where I live. This is where I live. And I said, well, I'm concerned because I live in this neighborhood. I'd like to know. And he says, okay, sir, you're good to go. You're good to go. And I said, well, could you tell me a little bit more? What and when? Because I wanted to know. And he said the description was, male black with dreadlocks. Well, I pretty much looked the way I look now. I mean, I looked the same way, but I was still pulled over. And I kidded with a friend. I said, well, did I take my dreadlock wig off and put it in the back seat? But my point is, even if I had dreadlocks, which is nothing wrong with that, if I did, why me? Why me? And so those are the kind of things that I said, this is about a year and a half ago, maybe 2. And I thought about that, and I thought about that experience. And I said, again, a very nice officer, did his job, but for whatever reason, he pulled me over. And obviously he saw me, when he saw me coming head on, I didn't look like his description, but I was pulled in. And so you learn from it. And I will say this, Carrie, one of the things I'll say, you asked me about the experiences. I used to ask myself when I was younger, wow, whether it's in university, if it's at work or along my career, why do some of these things happen to me? And I would just ponder and says, wow, why do people treat me this way? And as I got a little older, I realized, I said, this is for me to take these experiences and make them a positive. And at this point, to be able to share and be able to help people learn and understand. Because if you hadn't gone through it, there'd be somebody says, oh, I've never experienced any of that. Well, you don't understand what many, many people go through.
Yeah. Listening to you, like you said, and for those who haven't, definitely check out his book and the documentary, because you do hear, again, so many people with similar stories. Again, nothing has happened. There's just kind of this profiling. And I think what was interesting, because, as you're saying, when you're saying, why me? And I always think, like, why is this happening? Like when we just talked about earlier, sometimes I'm like, you just respect somebody. Like it seems so simple. And something you kind of talk about in the book, and something that you also talk about in the documentary, I think someone else mentions, is that, it's not really seen as like an individual person issue. It's a system issue. Can you talk to what that means when we talk about racism or these things happening, why it's more of a system issue than it is necessarily a person issue?
Yeah, I think when you listen to the young men in the documentary, when you look at some different aspects in my book, and I've talked to many, many, many folks across the country. Another good friend of ours, Todd Belcourt, attorney in Chicago, talks about the traumas and the repeatability of these things. The reason I think system gets applied is to the point that whether you're in Missouri, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, wherever you are, individuals that you don't know, if you bring a group of people together, men together, and they almost recount the same types of behavior, the same types of experiences for very, very similar experiences. And so what you've seen over the years, 50, 60 years, that common thread has proven that this is happening, everywhere to some degree. It may be worse in different areas, but I think that's when men sit down and they talk and they says, wow, I had that experience, and my dad had this experience, or my granddad had this experience, or my son had this experience. And when you start to see it being that pervasive, that's where that leans to the systemic nature of it. And then when you look at the other statistics, the details, the facts, the history, when you weave that narrative together, you start to understand these aren't random.
Mm-hmm. They are definitely not. I just wanted to share with you real quick, just some people that are watching. Queenie says, great discussion. We also have Gil who says, this is a great interview. And then I also have, it looks like Sangeeta says, this is so insightful. Everyone needs to listen up to raise awareness and to understand the perspective of others. So I appreciate, you kind of talking to this. And, it's not just about kind of bringing to light what's happening. It's also about, okay, it is happening. And, every day we're trying to make it better. But the idea that it's going to fully go away, unfortunately, it's not, right? I mean, if the world didn't have problems, then what would we do all day, I guess, sometimes. But
Right.
it's kind of like, okay, here's where we're at. And a lot of people are frustrated, just like you said. And I told you before this, I had interviewed someone, a Black man in his 30s. And he just talked about, he's like, it's so exhausting to live in the US, these thoughts of moving somewhere else because it seems easier. And it's just frustrating and it's hard. But you suggest in your book, hey, okay, we can learn from this. We can grow from this. Can you talk about, just some of the steps or some of the things that you suggest that people can do to handle this, but also to move beyond it and to thrive in life?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. And you talk about the frustration, whether you see it on the news or you have it in private conversations. The way I characterize it is that specifically when it comes to some of those things that we've seen in the media, is that the constant use of a sledgehammer approach versus a feathered approach. And that sledgehammer approach is used over and over again, seemingly against one group of people, as opposed to a feathered touch for the same offenses for others. And I think that's where people are so frustrated when they look at the complete polar opposites for the exact same thing. And then when there's an attempt to say, let's look at facts. Let's understand the facts. If we look at the facts, logically, you'd have to say there's something here. And I think the frustration comes when people says, well, they ignore it, or it's either watered down, very same situation, but given a different group. I'd liken it to this. I have talked about this constantly. I think there has to be education and an understanding of facts historically and present day, and there has to be acknowledgement of those facts. One of the things I use as a comparison, or just as an analogy, we have to solve this very, very, very tough problem. Tough problems have existed for years and hundreds of years. But I talk about calculus, physics, geometry, chemistry. If you would use that, and just let's talk about that for a minute. There's certain things that teams come together to solve those really hard problems. But one thing, I'm an engineer by trade. One thing that is common, you have to agree upon the facts. And if you agree upon the facts, that may be that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit in most of the world. It might be a little bit weird in Antarctica or somewhere, but 32 degrees. It boils at 212, or pi is 3.1455. What, those numbers, they're facts. And if you start with the facts, you're able to actually start to break that problem apart, and you start to figure out pieces. Well, here's the deal with racism. You've got to get to the facts, and people have to accept those facts. So that's where education comes.
Hold on. I want to stop you there before you continue. Why is it so hard for some people to accept the facts that are there, do you think?
Because the facts are very, very tough to swallow.
Mm.
Could be based on what you've been taught, your beliefs, where you were raised. And, once that becomes a part of your psyche and a part of you, it's very hard to go against it. And so take, for example, another example I use, if your grandmother or your grandfather told you this is the way it is, this is what you should always do, you love that person. You love that person. You think dearly of them, even if they're departed. It is really hard to soul search and say, wow, grandmother was wrong, or grandfather was wrong, or mother was wrong. And then I think in the case when it comes to racism, the horrific nature of racism, the horrific atrocities that have been inflicted upon people, it's just hard to come to grips with it. And so what happens is people would maybe shy away from it, not really accept it, deny it. But what you really have to do is rip off the Band-Aid and say, listen, we've got to understand this. I've said this many times. Racism and prejudice all throughout history, when those things have been allowed to abound and they have not been addressed, they have created issues and havoc for countries, for nations, for regions. And, I don't talk about this in the book, but I talk about it in one of my other speeches, where if you I take historical perspectives and show you what racism has done. And unfortunately, these have been just tragic. And then afterward, the postmortem is, wow, we should have done this. We should have done that. Well, it's too late then. It's way too late. So what we do today is we have a chance to educate. And I don't think it's people of color's responsibility to educate everyone. There's some people who just don't know. There's some people who are oblivious. There's some people who don't want to know. I think people have to educate themselves and get the right facts and make sure it's common. Then I think the informing, that's when you've got to cascade, Carrie, you got to cascade that information out to your friends. If you're on Facebook, you're on social media, dispel the misspoken words and the untruths and the things that are not legitimate. You have to stand forward and say, wait a minute, that's not right. And then once you start to inform, you have to come to an acknowledgement and realize that I can't deny this anymore. I've got to get to a point where this is for real. This is for real. And then ask yourself, what can we do in terms of getting to common ground, increasing understanding? But as we do that, listening to individuals. What are your experiences? Because too many times what happens, Carrie, it's really easy. Hey, we got a solution. People come together. We got a solution in 5 minutes. They sit down. We got this thing fixed and that's good. Everybody feels good. That won't work. It takes a deep, passionate, long invested commitment to fixing this. You've got to listen to people. You got to understand. Some of it may not be easy. And then you've got to earn trust. And then that trustworthiness brings people together. And that's when you start to have healing. But you've got to get all these other steps in place first before you can start to create actions, take action, allies, bringing in allies. I think it's a unfortunate situation that has happened over the last year with Mr. Floyd's murder and those kind of things. But one of the positive things I've seen is that the allies of all races, creeds, and colors saying this is wrong. This is what we need to do. I think that is the seminal moment for us to say people know the difference between right and wrong, respect or disrespect. Don't be silent. Let's come together and let's be allies and stick together to make this world a better place. Because if we do that, then we're able to tamp down these issues and these scourges of discrimination and all of these untruths and these things that tear us apart and divide us.
Yes, again, 100% yes. It's interesting because I don't know if you ever feel this way, but on social media, sometimes there's the most hate because people are behind their computer, and there's always a lot during political times, whenever someone's coming into office. And there's always this kind of mix of like, do I say something? Do I ignore it? Do I just block this person? And I've had all three. And I had a woman that was really saying just some hateful stuff. And I knew her in person. Mm-hmm. And I finally, I had to say to her, I was like, look, I said, I'm trying to say, look, hey, I've met you before. I know you're a good person. Do you understand what you're saying? And trying to get her to understand like why what she's saying is hateful and inappropriate and wrong. And it was interesting because people were like, yeah, we need to be nice to each other. And she kept going. And then I was like, I said, look, if I ever see you in person again, I'm going to be respectful to you. But for now, I need to stop this connection online because I'm not going to allow it to come on my page and upset people. But how do you deal with even stuff in that way? If you're seeing stuff, either it's towards you or towards others, do you tend to be someone that always says something? Do you ignore it? Do you block it? Or do you have any recommendations on that at all?
A lot of times what I do, especially in the social media realm, I try not to get into those discussions. I try to figure out where can we be most effective. Those people that I know are those people that I see, whether it's Zoom or what have you. Another fantastic outcome of being in COVID was that during that period where we were going through the social, the protests, the things of injustice, people from all races and colors and creeds call, says, John, what's going on? Can we talk about this? And I'd spend hours with people, friends from India and from Canada and the West Coast and different places. We're talking about things that they didn't really understand. So I think for me, I try to be effective there, and I try to give examples, and I try to use a lot of metaphors and analogies and say, let's play this out. We're going to put you in this position and put you in that person's shoes. Now let's talk about it from a fact-based perspective. These things happen. These things happen. These things happen. How would you feel? How do they make you feel? And if we could start, for me, I'm like one at a time. If we can bring people together one at a time. Again, my mother, for those who get the book and you see about the book, as much as I was learning about the tightrope, she talked about me being a connector, how to bring people together. And my father talked about it, loving everyone, looking at our family and understanding the differences and the varying perspectives. And how in the world can you be prejudiced or racist when you look at this rainbow of individuals and this kind of thing? So I do believe in bringing people together and understanding there are points of view, there are different perspectives, but everyone has to get this foundational set of facts right, because you can't water those down. The whole notion of getting to taking action and having allyship and education and informing and growing the pie and bringing people together is that you've got to get those foundational facts straight. If you water them down, or if you're dismissive of those, you really are being disingenuous and you lose the trust, that trust foundation that's required to bring everyone together.
Can you share any of the facts? When you're talking about facts, there's many, but is there any that a couple that you feel like these are ones that people should be more aware of?
Well, I think one is I recommend to folks to really understand the history of African American or Black people in America. I think you should go back and look at, well, actually, let's go back further than that. Let's go back and understand the Civil War. Let's understand slavery. Let's understand the precursors to slavery. Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about 1619. I think that's a great document to set the stage and as you go through it. But there's a lot of information to walk you through those 300 years or so in slavery. But then even beyond that, Reconstruction, what happened in Reconstruction? What were the issues? Then moving into post Reconstruction and Jim Crow. I think a lot of people have to understand what it was like in those traumas, those physical, mental, spiritual traumas and anguish that people, a whole group of people had to suffer, very much so, not to the 50s, but to the 80s and things that have persisted. I tell people to look at what happened to Emmett Till. If you just want to take a moment and take an example, think about a child that that's 14 years old, a young man, which is a child, and read what was done to Emmett Till for what we found out was, not true at all. But this young man was killed. And then when you start to look at an environment that creates that hate, you start to understand what we have to counter and what we cannot live with and cannot get back to. We must come together. We must unite. This is the greatest nation in the world, but in order to live up to its true promises and to live up to its true meaning, Black men and Black boys have to have that respect, that understanding. People of color, I talk about it in the book, people of color, women, LGBTQ, anyone who's been marginalized, for this country to live up to its true creed and live up to what was written on paper. We have to come together and we have to recognize those things. I think it's just imperative. And some people will say, well, those are really one-off morbid situations. Carrie, there's so many people we don't know about.
Yep.
There's so many people who have parents or grandparents who lived through various stages in life and endured so many hardships, where there was sharecropping. I would advise people to go look at the whole notion of sharecropping. What did that do to a whole generation of people, multiple generations of people post-slavery? The more we know, the better off we can be. And that's just something I just encourage people. Read, educate, but don't just read one thing. It's good to read a plethora of information and come to the central themes and thoughts to make sure that you don't get on the fringes.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think, like you said, we don't know everything that's happened. And sometimes the media will show something. And unfortunately, we are desensitized. We see it happen so much that we kind of ignore it. We're like, oh, it's just another one. Add it to the list. Same with, mass shootings, which strangely enough tend to be more white males, even though there are more Black males that are targeted. So it's, again, like you said, kind of getting the facts, not just relying on one source of media or just one piece of it is really important. One of the other things that you talk about, and a lot of people have, is just your faith and your belief in God and a higher power. And there are different religions and different ways that people look at that. But you talk about how for you having that reminds you that, as you said earlier, even maybe when you don't feel like you want to treat someone well back when they're being nasty to you, it reminds you to take the higher road. Can you talk a little bit about how your faith was kind of instilled in you through your family, and then why that's important to you, and why you think it's an important piece that people should have regardless of their religious affiliation?
Yeah, the faith component of my life is wrapped completely together with the whole notion of respect and dignity. My mother and father, those things were taught and were interwoven. So the natural connection is there. I realize that, and I'll say this now to you and your audience, I said it in the book, is that I believe my faith is the thing that sustains me. And it sustains me in a way to keep me inspired, motivated, and to realize that I have a higher calling and a higher purpose. And that is for me to treat people with dignity and respect, show the way, set the example, but also realize that there is a higher calling on my life. There's a higher authority. And I tell people in the book, I says, even if you don't have a faith-based approach, find something that is important to you, that you are passionate about, and that is not so much superficial and worldly and tangible. It's a higher calling. Seek out that higher calling and go from there. And I think my faith has sustained me through, I mentioned in the book, the good, the ugly, the bad, the indifferent. I've seen a lot. And I think that's what kept me strong. Now, don't get me wrong. There have been some days I've been down and depressed, and there may be more, because you see things, but you have to bounce back. You have to bounce back and say, okay, it's a new day. What can we do? And I always look at it like when I wrote this book, I said, if it helps just one person have a different perspective, and if it helps one person to be motivated or inspired to keep their head up and endure whatever they're going through, then I've succeeded.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And as we're coming up here on the hour, one of the last things I want to talk about that you say in the book is also really looking at, how you can give back. And part of how you're giving back is this piece of kind of working with young men, getting them to kind of think bigger, kind of think of, again, despite all this, you can thrive. Can you talk about the importance of why you think that we should have something beyond, just our job or just things like that, but that rather, where are ways that we can give back and how do we find what that is?
Well, Carrie, I came to the realization a long time ago. I mean, there are a lot of folks in the world, my friends, and everybody has aspirations. Whatever your vocation may be, medicine, business, whatever it is, you're striving to be the best. You're trying to attain and to achieve. You have a family, you have all of these things. And those are the things that you live for. But I came to the realization that, wow, this is bigger than me. It's bigger than me, and it's not all about me. The things that I have received, the blessings that I have gotten, it's up to me to try to share that and to share words of wisdom. How can I have a broader impact on, my sphere of influence, but even the broader world? And that's where I think individuals just don't know the things that they can do and what they can unleash. It may not be 100 people. It may just be one person in your office. It may be one kid on your soccer team, or it may be somebody in your Boy Scout troop or a Girl Scout troop, or it may be someone in your church group. You just never know the individual that is there, and you're that conduit to help them be better in life. And I believe this, and I say this in the book as well. I think that every interaction is universally connected. I don't believe in happenstance or it just happened. I think in 10 seconds or 15 minutes, or if it's 10 years, the words you say and the things you do could boost a person's life, boost their spirits, or you could be the person that sucks the life out of a person. And I tell people, you don't want to be the person that sucks the life out of people. They see you coming. We want to encourage people, coach and guide. And that's in leadership, whether you're CEOs, whether you're vice presidents, bank vice presidents, whether you're coaches on a basketball team, you're an entrepreneur, let your creative juices flow and help those individuals around you. And again, it may be one person, maybe 10 people, maybe 10,000. You never know. So that's why I feel about it. I'm so passionate about that.
Yeah. And I agree because it's interesting because a lot of people always, when they decide they want to kind of do something like that, they always feel like it has to be millions of people, but it can be one person. And you hear sometimes people's stories and they talk about that one teacher or that one friend or the one parent that really made such a difference in their life. And that's really what matters as a whole. Just wanted to share too, we had one other person from LinkedIn that said, thank you so much for showcasing John, definitely giving you some love here as well.
Thank you.
John, where can people get the book, the documentary? Tell us the name again, and where is the best place to watch and to read both of these?
Sure. The book can be purchased on Amazon. It's What About Me? Walking the Tightrope as a Black Man in America. It's out on Amazon. It hit bestseller, a couple of weeks ago.
Congrats.
A lot of love for that. We want more people to read it, understand it, share, and use it as a tool. The documentary, What About Me, is now streaming on Amazon Prime Video. So it's out there. Had great feedback on that as well. And really, it's to be huge thanks to all the folks that work with me. Again, on the documentary, my co-executive producers, Taru Brooks and Daryl Pitts, and some great folks that were included in that, Todd Belcour and Cirillo Menego III, just a lot of great people who poured input into it. But as I've stated before, my goal is to give back on a broader stage and to help more people and to help educate, inspire, encourage, and provide a catalyst for conversation.
I love it. The last question I like to ask all of my guests, John, is what is one word or quote or mantra that you try to live by every single day?
Respect, respect, respect. I always keep it at the forefront. Respect people.
Perfect. I thank you so much for being here, for sharing your personal story, for creating, not only the book, but a documentary for other people to share their story. And I look forward to hearing more about what you're going to be doing with this and kind of expanding, like you said, this kind of legacy and social change that you're trying to work on. So I thank you so much, John, for being here. And I look forward to hearing more soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.